Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 262 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. These days, it's becoming more and more important to find ways to reduce, reuse, and recycle, not only for the sake of the planet, but for the sake of our increasingly packed lives and homes. New and high-tech solutions are being proposed on the daily, but what if some of the best ideas reside not in the future, but in the past? This week, I spoke with Dr. Annette Kehnel about sustainability in the Middle Ages. Annette is the chair of medieval history at the University of Mannheim and the author of many books on medieval history, sustainability, and economy, mostly written in German. Her new book, translated into English by Gesche Ibsen, is The Green Ages: Medieval Innovations in Sustainability. Our conversation on the way medieval people shared, recycled, and upcycled is coming up right after this. Well, welcome, Annette. I am so delighted to meet you and to talk about sustainability. Welcome to the Medieval Podcast.
Danièle, hello. Thank you for inviting me.
So you start out your book with a pretty spicy statement, which is modern strategies have had their day. So what do you mean by that?
Well, we are historians, and modernity in terms of a history that is 200 years old, more than 200 years old. And I think it's time to reflect that using concepts that were developed in the 19th and early 20th century for solving problems we have in the 21st century might, at least be questionable. So why not try and step back and say, we might need new strategies. And me being a medieval historian, I would say we have inspiration by looking at times before modernity. So before Enlightenment, before the 19th century, before the second height of industrialization, and then the third industrialization and everything. So that's just the history of pre-modern times being an inspiration for maybe new concepts for solving problems of the 21st century.
Right. I think that you're totally on the right track in that we need to rethink things because they're not going well enough now to keep going this way for too much longer. So you've organized the book around the idea of sustainability. And when we talk about sustainability right now, we're kind of talking about saving the planet, keeping the planet from having climate change or keeping ourselves from being overwhelmed with things. In the Middle Ages, life is completely different. So what are people thinking about in terms of sustainability? Are they thinking about saving the planet? Where does sustainability come into the medieval mindset?
No, of course, nobody was thinking about saving the planet in the 14th century. First of all, in the 21st century, basically, it's not about saving the planet. It's about saving our home on this planet, because the planet will be fine without us.
Yes.
We know that. So it's really a matter of, will Homo sapiens have a future on this planet? And that's really the problem. So that was the first point. As to sustainability in the Middle Ages, there was no such word in the Middle Ages. It's an invention, or it was first cultivated by Hans Carl von Carlowitz. We have this Silvicultura Economica from the year 1705, where the word is first mentioned as meaning living within the boundaries of our needs so that the needs of future generations won't be impeded. Actually, Anna Amalia from Braunschweig, Wolfenbüttel, she was the first to put a reform of forestry in place. So she again would have that outspoken concern for the needs of future generations. This is 18th century. However, before the 18th century, quite obviously, people knew very well how to live without destroying the basics of life for the future, for their children. And I mean, we have an interest in preserving a home for our children and grandchildren. And I have sometimes the impression that in the 20th century, we forgot that. We sort of focused on here and now, hic et nunc, and sort of learned, we have a cultural sort of mindset of short-sightedness, which is paying off very well. You're fixed on quarterly results in the outcomes of a company and everything. So that's what makes you rich, but it doesn't make you rich to look for the concerns of future generations or the concerns of your company in 10 or 20 years. And that's a big problem. So my idea is that people in medieval times were better in long time thinking than us. It doesn't mean they were, always good to nature. Of course not. We know they destroyed forests and we know they destroyed the foundations of their life in many cases. But what I see and what we found out as historians over the last 100 years, there are lots of cases where you see, it's what we call case studies for how to do things. And I try to highlight those, just reminding us, people knew how to live within a balance with nature. We can also go to cultures outside Europe. That's where we often look for traditional knowledge about living in harmony with nature. But I try to remind us that we also find examples in the European traditions.
Yes, and I think that is a very good point that you're making, where it doesn't have to be one or the other. We can take in the knowledge that we have about medieval Europe. We can add it to the knowledge we have about indigenous traditions all over the world. We can do these things together at the same time.
Yeah. But it's all about sort of getting rid of this idea of uniqueness of Europe,
Yes.
We did a lot of harm with that sort of concept. It's about unlearning and sort of getting things back into right proportions and into a balance. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that unlearning comes with learning. And I think that bringing this, as we're saying, all together can only be to the good. So one last place I want to situate ourselves before we get into the arguments of the book is that you talk a lot about seems to be an accepted part of Western culture, which is the tragedy of the commons. Can you tell us why you brought this up in the book and what it means to our understanding of sustainability, especially when we are looking backwards?
Well, one of the big troubles about our ways of doing economy and the foundations of modern economy are based on principles of ownership, private ownership. And as we can see, the world before 1800 was very much organized, even in Europe, without strict private ownership principles. We call this sort of property commons. So you have access and you have rights to use a piece of land or water or whatever, but you don't own it. Now, the problem with 21st century climate change problematics and everything is that the concept of private property is really getting at its limits, because it doesn't make much sense to sort of keep the air above your house proper, and clean. So we are dealing with problems of commons and resources that cannot be privatized. They can be privatized, but it doesn't make sense because you're still breathing the air, which is polluted or whatever. So if we look at the way economy was done in many of these commons resource managements or commons resource regimes, shows that people had a clear idea how to use these resources without destroying them. The tragedy of the commons is a concept that has been put into our minds by Garrett Hardin in the late 1960s. He wrote an article in Nature, and he says, what's used by everybody is going to be abused by everybody, if you want. And we, of course, know this phenomenon because if you look at the office and you have a tea kitchen, everybody wants to drink tea, but nobody wants to do the cleaning up or to repair the sink if it's broken or whatever. So this seems to be very logical daily life experience and knowledge. What everybody owns is not going to work. Now, this research, again, is half a century old. Garrett Hardin is long dead and he was a good man and everything. But, we have more research. One of the most prominent protagonists for more recent research is Elinor Ostrom, Nobel Prize winner, who shows, as an economist, that humans are actually very well capable of managing commons and common property and using resources without destroying them. So lobster fishing is one of her examples. And she says, actually, it's not about, using resources. Everybody has access and takes as much as he or she wants, but it's rather that communities give each other rules. They give themselves rules and they make sure that, you have to live within the limits that are allowed for using the resource without destroying it and for keeping it in use next year and the year after, and then for your children and grandchildren. So the Lake of Constance is a very good example for that and has been worked not by me, but Michael Zeheter, who's a Trier historian in Germany. And it shows that these people were regularly meeting and they were regularly adapting the rules for the fishery, the size of the mashes in the net, and maybe also quota for fishing or times when you don't have the right to fish this or that fish. And they were adapting these rules whenever it was needed. So we have laws that change continuously. And historians have long seen this as a problem because if you have a law, you have to change all the time. They think, oh, it was a bad law. No, but no, the opposite is the case. The sort of adaptability and the flexibility of these laws and the lawmaking and the communication about the rules we give us for the year to come. This was an essential prerequisite for making these common economies work. But then in the late 18th and 19th century, they sort of abolished them. Tine de Moor in Rotterdam, she's one of the protagonists as well as a historian who's working on this field very much and very brilliant sort of forms of corporate collective action. And I really like the work she does because you can really be reminded, yes, we can, if only we want.
Yes. And I think a big part of that is making sure that people feel emotionally invested. They feel like it's something that they have some control over. It makes a lot of sense that if you have some control over the rules, you're more likely going to follow them. So it could work in the tea room as well if everyone is part of the rulemaking.
It does work, but then obviously it means also to stick to rules, and communication is a very big issue, and that's what we underestimated. I think that's what Eleanor Ostrom says as well. Yeah.
Yes. And so when we're talking about publicly owned areas, privately owned areas, when you're talking about how this might work in a case study, for example, we work a lot with beguines. And I did talk about beguines on a previous episode of this podcast, but can you tell us about beguines? First of all, tell us what they are, remind us what they are, and then how this works within your theory of sustainability being something that we find in the Middle Ages.
Well, the beguines are more or less an example for a way of life within the boundaries of social sustainability. So if you have economic, ecological, and social sustainability, I would say the beguines are sort of sharing communities. They don't share possessions. By definition, they share lifetime, they share space, but they live as individuals or in groups in a diversity of lifestyles, if you want. Some of them are very rich and they live with their housemates and they live with servants in a house they build themselves. We have examples from Marseille in Roubaix, where we know even that these women were actually what we would call capital investors today. So if you needed funding for a new sort of startup, you would go there and the rich Bedouins would give you money for your startup. So that's one side of it. But at the same time, you have rather poor women who live sometimes in communities, community housing, and share flats and share kitchens and have common rules for living together. This is all within special quarters of the cities that in the 13th century were constructed with the purpose to give women space where they sort of live, and from there they followed their work. It's a very what would I call it? It's not a strange phenomenon, but it's something which we did not really, it doesn't fit into our understanding, because what we know is we have religious women and women, and we have other secular women. Whereas the Beguines are something in between. We call them semi-religious women because they follow certain rules, but then you enter this community, you move into this quarter of the city, especially cities in Flanders, so Ghent or Brugge, Amsterdam, they all have, even down to today, wonderful beguinages, and they are very, attractive places to live today because they have this green space that was kept over the centuries, not with the original buildings from the 13th century, of course, but still the space and the arrangement is really something which we would today call the cultivation and traditional cultivation of urban gardens. And that's the lungs of these cities. Anyway, so you live in this community, but if you want to marry, you can move out again. You don't do a vow. You're not obliged to stay there all your life. And all of them were working women. So some of them were working in the textile industry. Some of them were doing what today we call care for the people who are dying.
Yes,
So
like hospice care.
yeah, hospice care, and then others sick care. But then we also have farming. We have women who do gardening. There is a grass gardener amongst one of the women we can find. And also you have farms within the Beguinage and hints. That's not in my book on the Green Ages, but there was so much. I was so surprised finding all this out, because you see they have contracts with land and then employ farmers to do the harvest, or they rent land to get the grass or orchards or whatever. And it's really interesting to see this economy of female communities within the cities. And of course, they enjoy the protection of the city councils very often, the bishop, and also the local priests. They have hospitals, they have bakeries, they have breweries, all within the boundaries of their civitas beginarum, the cities of ladies. That's one of the sort of even contemporary term which is used. Walter Simons is a historian who studied them a lot, but there are lots. And there is a German historian, Leta Böhringer, and she says, these women were just brilliant in reinventing themselves ever, ever, and ever. And that was difficult for historical research because obviously historians want to have categories. And these women didn't fit into these categories.
Yes.
So
Yes.
in the late 19th century, by the way, the only explanation, there was an economic Herr Bücher, and he says, he's an economist, and he says, there's no explanation for this way of living for women. There must have been a surplus of women, too many women, and that's why they built these communities to keep them close or whatever. But there is no evidence whatsoever that we have more women than men in 13th century. Well, just like today, there is always 51 and 49 or whatever, but there was no other historical fantasy.
It's just interesting where there has to be a surplus, so they need to be stored somewhere instead of them having a choice to decide to build their own way of life. So one of the things that you touched on, I could talk about Beguines all day. I think they're so interesting. But one of the things you
there is
touched
so
on,
much, and they were different all over the place as well. And today we have the cities in Flanders where we can really see them, and then of course we have lots of communities. They are rebuilding themselves. We have in Cologne, we have 21st century Beguines. In Berlin, we have an architectural prize-winning Beguinage, which is very, very beautiful because it's intergenerational housing. So the architects are very keen on trying things like that out. So there is a big movement, a Beguine movement today, which I found very interesting.
yes, I love that they're taking your idea and rolling with it, looking to the past for future solutions.
Mind you, I mean, obviously it's different in the 21st century than the 13th or in the 70s or in the 18th, but I think just for getting ideas in our heads and thinking, I mean, in German, my book is called We Did Do Things Differently. Wir konnten auch anders, we could do things differently. And I think that's giving an idea that we can do them differently in the future if we did them differently in the past. It doesn't mean imitating the past. I don't want that. And I don't want to live in the Middle Ages. Huh? Certainly not.
I have yet to meet a medievalist that actually wants to live back there. None of us do. Once you learn about it, you really don't. But one of the things you touched on in speaking about Beguines is their investments, their loans and things like that. And so one of the things that you bring up in the book is microfinance, or you're putting it in the terms of microfinance. So can you tell us about how this worked in the Middle Ages?
Well, it's an institution we call Monti di Pietà in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages. They were founded in the late 15th century in the northern parts of Italy. And that was, again, like, by the way, Flanders in the 13th century. There was a big movement within urban communities, and then they founded the first beguinas. And the same is true for Italy in the late 15th century, where you have a real flowering economy and big changes within the cities. And then, like always, people realized, and also the city councils realized, that economic growth not only produces winners, but also losers. So you have to do something for these people in order to avoid they drop out and become sort of dependent on our alms and whatever. And that's why this city council organized, with the help of mendicant preachers who did the marketing, if you want, and the campaigns for getting the capital, the investment capital you need. But they sort of organized small-scale loans for people who don't have much. Not for the very poor, but what they called the fat poor, paupers pignores. So they are not real poor, but they are maybe a shoemaker who needs leather to produce his shoes, or a farmer in the nearby farming lands of a city. So the idea is that if I'm a farmer near Bologna or Perugia, in April, I can go to the Monte di Pietà and there put my winter coat and then take out a loan for the winter coat. They keep the coat, and I get money to buy my seed and then to sow it. And then after harvest in September, you hopefully have some returns from the land, and then you go to the bank and get your winter coat out. So it's really with ponds. It's like, and you very well organized. And it was an honorary job circulating year from year within the elites of these cities. And the capital was sort of organized or put in by rich people. They were collecting campaigns. Interestingly, I mean, there is a black side. It worked very well, really, because it was short-term loans and small-scale loans. Very often it went hand in hand against the professional money lenders, who were very often Jewish. So that's the dark side of the story. But ironically, the Jewish people in the city were often capital givers, very powerful capital givers for these Monti. That's interesting. My colleague Tanja Skambraxstrom from Graz, she worked on it. And then, of course, Italians. In Bologna, you have a very big center. So if anybody who wants to go into this is Bologna, there is an institute for these Monti di Pietà. And you can just see, again, it's a way of guaranteeing social sustainability for everybody in times of growth and economic wealth, making sure that the balance within the communities is not getting out of scale. Yeah.
Yes, and it's such a clever idea. And it's one that hasn't been completely lost. People have revived it in terms of microloans. You can actually be part of microloans in different places in the world today. So people can go on the internet and figure out how to do that. But it keeps people from sinking all the way into poverty and then having to be pulled all the way out of poverty. It just allows people to get past those difficult moments, like just before springtime if you're a farmer. And it's just brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, there are other examples. You have, for example, house building for poorer people, or people who in Augsburg, we have a Fuggerei, which is a very old foundation for small-scale housing for families who get into poverty without being, without reason really, or not because they don't want to work, but because they have had bad luck or whatever. So, and there again, you're supposed to live for a year for very, very small scale rent. Even today, you pay €1 per year or €5 per year, and it's still existing. It's a really long-term way of housing for poorer families with children that has survived over the ages. It's quite famous. Fuggerei. If ever you go to Augsburg, go to the Fuggerei and you can look at it. It survived the Second World War when it was very badly hit by bombs, but they rebuilt it, and still today you can live there for €5 a year.
Wow, that's
For
incredible.
a certain time. Yeah, you're not supposed to stay there all the time, but if you need to breathe and get your finances and your economies right, you can take advantage. Mind you, you have to be from Augsburg. So it's only for Augsburg citizens.
Well, we've talked about how limits are good and living
Yes.
within those limits makes things better,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
I think that's incredible. One of the things that I always find very interesting, and it didn't necessarily occur to me until I came across it when I was studying the Middle Ages in my undergraduate degree, is the idea of secondhand shops or recycling or repair. And this is something that really gets to me in the modern world. I would much rather repair something than have to throw it out. In the Middle Ages, there's a whole system, a whole community for recycling and repair, right? So can you tell us about how that works?
Well, certainly people always threw away things. No worry about that. But at the same time, I think there were times when we were much more intelligent in the use of resources than we are today. So just wasting clothes only because they have a hole or whatever, it was just not, it seemed very stupid. So I think people were much cleverer than we are today, because the way we do linear economy and we produce T-shirts for 50 pence and then wear them once and throw them away, it's just a very economically, it might be attractive at the moment because you don't pay for production. But in terms of using resources intelligently, it's just such a stupid thing to do. So the way circular uses were made of cloth or of housing and repair in whatever you have, pans or bags or whatever, that was very part of daily life. I mean, obviously we find waste in cloaces. How do you call them? These waste bins, medieval waste bins, we have them. But there you see that things you threw away were often repaired ever and ever. So my example in the book is really Frankfurt, the city of Frankfurt, where you have textbooks. They burned in the Second World War, but luckily a historian, the same, by the way, who thought Beguines were the result of too many women, Karl Bücher, and he looked through all these textbooks of the city of Frankfurt, Bette Bücher they were called, and then he was very surprised, first of all, because there were so many professions, over 1,000 professions you found in these textbooks. And secondly, because there were many women. He didn't expect that as well. And thirdly, because there were so many repair professions. So you have Humpler, you have Blecker, and they all have different names. You have vendors, the people who resell things professionally and make their living. And the interesting thing is that if you are in a Frankfurt textbook in the 14th and 15th century, it means you are amongst the more or less well-off people, because the very poor, they didn't pay tax. They paid a different sort of tax. So it becomes clear that you could make a living by repairing things. And you were even amongst the accepted people, because today we always think, repair is for times of crisis, and nobody after World War II, our parents or grandparents had to repair their things and so on. But then came the economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, and then after that we started really to live as we should, and we didn't need to repair. We lost actually cultural techniques of repair. They went into oblivion. And that's a very, very interesting sort of cultural process, how quick we lost awareness of this and how easily we lost the capacity to repair our clothes or whatever. But my idea is if it's so quick we lost it, we can also very quickly reacquire it, And actually, there are lots of very fascinating circular economy movements in using clothes, in sharing clothes, in one example I also have in my book, which was a real miracle for me. I mean, paper was over 2,000 years really made from waste. It's something which we are not aware of. We have very, very little clothing of medieval times in museums today. Why? Because all the clothes, when they were used and reused and repaired and reused, they went into the paper mill and then you made paper from it. In Germany, it's Hadernpapier, which is, I don't know what it is in English, but that was the way we produced paper for a long time. And only in the 18th century, wood became the resource for paper. And I think now we again there you have an enormous amount of alternative resources for producing paper. Elephant dung is one of them, or scraps of apples. So if you make apple juice, you have a rest and you can produce, from the rest that's left over from the apple juice, they experiment with paper, making paper from it. And it's so interesting. And I think that's one of the sort of movements I would like to push, just daring to use, to look for other resources. And there are lots of historical examples that show us that it's always a very hard way to sort of try different things. So it takes 20 years to make an overnight success. It's one of the ideas that's certainly true for history. And everybody says, no, it's not working. But then at some stage it is working. And I think history is full of examples for that.
Yes, I think that the idea of recycling clothing is worth bringing up and turning it into things like paper because before even the 20th century, up to that point, really, you have people who have a shirt or something and then it becomes a washcloth and then it becomes a rug and then maybe it becomes paper. So it has all these different lives. It doesn't just end up in a landfill. And it's possible to do these things again. Yes, if it's plant fiber, we can do something with it. I love it.
By the way, also the building industry is full of examples for using and reusing building material. I mean, it's also that old things give a tradition and give a history, and so they add value. The chair, the throne of Charlemagne in Aachen is one example, which I'm talking about. I mean, they get all these old stones, marble from Jerusalem and wherever, and they fix this. We would call it a bricolage today, and they fixed the chair. They could have done differently, but I think they wanted to add tradition. They wanted to add history and make things valuable. And that's really one of the secrets as well of rebuilding and reusing.
Yes, it's interesting to hear you say that as a historian, because I think as a historian, we're often centered on keeping things as they are, right? Don't recycle marble from Jerusalem or from Rome and use it for something else. We need it to stay exactly as it is. But you're making the opposite argument in that. Why not? Why don't we use this? We'll give it a greater significance or a different significance by just recycling it. So the last thing that you get at is pretty straightforward, and that is minimalism. So I think it's worth spelling this out because I think that maybe a wider perception of the Middle Ages is people didn't have very much because they couldn't afford very much or they didn't like to have very much. But there's a lot of intentional minimalism that's happening in the Middle Ages as well, right? Is this what you found?
Yes, well, that's interesting. It's not only in the Middle Ages. I mean, there is a human urge or need to have ever more. We want something, we want more, and we want more again, and so on. But what I found is that, not only me, but there's Ernst Schumacher and people who really did this small is beautiful, that just the same way as we have this urge for getting more and more, the history of civilization also shows that there are always voices that make sure the want for less and less. So freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. That would be a sort of Janis Joplin voice, but this voice is, you can see it and trace it through the ages. From Greek philosophers, you have Diogenes, who is lived in a barrel on a marketplace in Athens, and he was sort of the freest and richest man. That's what he talked to people, and not even Alexander the Great could sort of make him happy when he asked him, "Can I do something for you, poor boy?" Diogenes, he would say to him, "Yes, please go out of the sun. I want, you're hiding the sun from my face." So this is sort of the iconography of the liberty of having nothing to lose and then being really free. And one of the big protagonists of this idea is, of course, Saint Francis in the Middle Ages, and Clare, who sort of unfold the beauty of voluntary poverty and having nothing in a very powerful way and give very powerful images. And again, this movement, this Franciscan and Claretian movement, starts in the 13th century when you have economic growth in the cities and when you have sort of changes and you have crises, and there this voice becomes very, very loud again. And it's just beautiful. It's also linked with a very mature and immediate relationship to nature. So people, you feel so acquainted. I mean, Francis and also Claire, they talk to animals and they address the sun as brother sun and sister moon. And so it's a relationship to nature, to the world, which makes us jealous sometimes because you feel a sort of richness in a very different way. And that's what makes this movement so attractive down to today. I mean, it's, they reinvent themselves over the generations and in many different religious and non-religious contexts. And you have them, of course, in every religion. I mean, this way of even just temporary poverty and having the experience of living with nothing or living with very little is one of the secrets of personal fulfillment. Marie Kondo, why would she be so successful? I mean, she must be known in US as well. And
Sure.
she tells us how to get rid of all this stuff we don't need, and she makes a fortune with it. So we make a fortune. So there is the need within us to get rid of all this, the load of possession. And that I found very interesting. I was very, very fascinated myself when I wrote that chapter. And it's very touching in a way to make that voice, listening to that voice within our history, because what historians usually do, they show the rise of humanity, and that means getting more and more, getting more brilliant, more technology, more possession, more comfort, more progress, and whatever. That's one side of the story, but there is the other one, and I think there is a lot of music in that one.
Yes, and I think minimalism is one of those things that's very scary. So it makes sense that it comes hand in hand with faith, because you have to have faith that, you're going to be all right if you just have a few things. I think that we feel safety when we have a lot of things around us, when really it can be unsustainable when we're talking, especially in planetary terms. So yeah,
Yeah, but
minimalism is
also
something
even
that,
in private, I mean, we all know that property is a real load. It's heavy and it keeps us busy. So we
yes.
are actually, many of us, we are really suffering from overload than rather underload. And by the way, I need to make clear, I'm not talking about involuntary poverty. The
Yes.
privilege to be voluntary poor is something very different. And that's what Francis or others are talking about. It is about solidarity with the involuntary poor, but it's not sort of a glorification of those of people who don't have anything. It's not that. It's really the liberty and the freedom to live a life without the load of heavy possessions.
Yes. Yes. I'm glad that you made that point, because I do think it's an important distinction. All right. So, as we wrap this up, you've researched into the Middle Ages, you've looked at it. At the end of your book, it feels hopeful. So, how are you feeling about the future? It's a big
Well,
question.
I actually make our friends from the Middle Ages talk. I said, it's very helpful to have a chat with the past every so often. And
Yes.
I thought about it, and then I would come to the conclusion that our friends in the Middle Ages, they would probably be jealous of us because we have reached so much. We have so much comfort. We have rights and we have democracies. We invented laws that give us a lot of liberty. And I think in the end, when they listen to our challenges we have to face today, they would certainly say, oh, yeah, it's a lot you have to carry there and you have to solve. But at the same time, they would say, listen, we always had challenges never seen of before. We always had crises never heard of before. And I think they would sort of not understand our frustration or desolation. They would rather say, you have so much, use the instruments you created, use technology, use social media, use what you developed in order to solve the problems. So they probably would be very hopeful for the future because they would trust in human creativity. And that's really what I would like to make. That's the point I would like to make at the end. I think trust in our creativity and also be hopeful for a future. Humans have survived a lot of challenges, and I think we can learn from the knowledge generations before us had accumulated.
Yes, I think that is the perfect place to wrap this up. And I am so on board with everything that you've said about using our creativity, about using our history, about being hopeful for the future and taking action. Thank you so much, Annette, for coming on and talking to us about the Green Ages.
Danièle, thank you very much. It was a very nice conversation. Thanks.
To find out more about Annette's work, you can visit her faculty page at the University of Mannheim or visit her books page at BrandeiseUniversityPress.com. Her new book is The Green Ages, Medieval Innovations in Sustainability. Before we go, here's Peter from Medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. So there's a lot of online information about what's a terrible medieval job, right? Like the gong farmer, the plague doctor. There was like even a whole TV series that was kind of dedicated to mostly, medieval terrible jobs. So I kind of was taking a look at what the reality behind that was, and I came across a really interesting piece by Jacques Le Goff, so he's a famous medieval historian. And he goes into what was really looked down upon in the Middle Ages. And he has a very interesting list. They include innkeepers, pastry makers, gardeners, fishermen, cobblers, and millers.
There's some surprising jobs on that list.
Yeah, these days we would think somewhat highly of these kind of jobs. So he goes into why these professions were looked down upon, particularly in the early Middle Ages, and why that really shifts towards the end of the Middle Ages, where it's a totally different view of what constitutes a good job and what constitutes a bad job. So we have that piece on that. So I hope that's going to be like a little myth breaking.
Yeah, well, I think the gong farmer is going to be on both lists because for people who don't know what a gong farmer is, this is a person that takes away the human waste, empties the latrines, and takes it out of the city. So I think that's going to be on all the lists.
Yeah, even though Jack doesn't mention that, I kind of think that no one was begging to become a gong farmer in the Middle Ages.
No, although it was a well-paying job at least. So there's that.
Indeed. So we've got that. Plus, we've got some new articles coming out. One by writer Patrick Russell on what education looked like in medieval Iceland. That was kind of very unique. And we also have Stephen Murillo telling us why the Battle of Hastings was an unusual battle.
These all sound like good articles to be reading about. And I love how there are always different articles that you can read about on Medievalist.net. You can find a little bit of everything.
Indeed. We try and throw something new every week.
Yes, and that's why it's been so successful for so long, right?
Indeed.
Thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of you out there whose kind generosity makes my work possible. Whether you're letting the ads play through, telling your friends about my books and podcasts, proudly wearing a 5-Minute Medievalist shirt from tpublic.com, or becoming a patron at patreon.com, your support is greatly appreciated. Patronage is the biggest part of how I pay the bills. So if you love this podcast, please consider joining the Patreon community to help a girl out and keep the medieval content going. You can find out how at patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from staying green to getting clean, follow Medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.